Welcome to Mindfulness Manufacturing. My name is Trevor Blondeel. Spending 25 years in manufacturing, I discovered the real impact we have on turnover, communication, and the ability to manage change is how we show up. That's the essence of emotional intelligence. In each episode, we bring a guest or message to expand your skills, engage your people, and grow your organization. So let's jump in. In life, we have these chance meetings. I had the opportunity to go to the winter workshop, National Speakers Association. And a couple weeks later, I'm in Nebraska for work. And somebody walks in and asks for a flash drive. And it's Kathy Parry, who I met just recently, 2 weeks ago. And I got to watch her keynote on the rubber band resilient leader. And I thought, okay, here it is. Another opportunity for mindfulness manufacturing. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It was a fun chance meeting.
And I got to be live at your keynote. And it got me thinking about this whole thing. I always ask people, like, how's it going? And they usually say busy, which means I'm just focused on the urgent stuff, not the important. And then I'll say, but how are you? And say, oh, it's all good. But you talked a little bit about honoring those feelings of like, how are we really doing? What have you learned about that, Kathy?
Great. Yeah. So in the Rubber Band Resilient Leader book, which you mentioned, I do dig kind of deep into the phases of someone being resilient, whether that's a resilient organization, a resilient team, a resilient leader, or just a resilient team member. And someone said recently, are we tired of resilience? But no, we need it because this is how we bounce back. It's how we, when I talk about the rubber band, it's how we stretch. We need that stretch in our lives to keep pushing us forward, but we don't want to snap. And I say that first phase in that resilience curve, there's a whole resilience curve that I've developed, is that reaction stage. So first, something happens to us, then we react. And that reaction is critical to those around us, to the process or the project that we might be working on. And we have to honor all the different types of reactions when something stretches us, but we can't live in that space. So when I work with teams, what I like to say is figure out everybody's initial reaction on your team. Have a conversation about it, like, oh my gosh, every time the line stops, he flips out, goes crazy, has to go for a smoke. That's his reaction. And it's like, okay, that's how he's going to react. So you know it, but maybe you can just step it back a little bit. Like, we know you got to have that reaction because reactions are emotional and we do get that. But starting the conversation around how do we react when things go wrong is a really great team building exercise.
And I just talked to my son this morning who called me on break. And he's working in manufacturing, 23 years old, and he's just getting that reaction from his leader. And I kind of asking him, well, how are you reacting to how your leader's speaking to you? And he says, well, I'm kind of firing back. Well, that may be triggering her and that whole chemistry of kind of what's going on. So what advice would you give to my son there if maybe his leader is triggering him?
Well, I think that's a perfect opportunity for a conversation. And if he's not comfortable going up to her and saying, hey, I'd like to have a conversation about how we are communicating. At that point, I would not call it reacting. I would call it how we communicate and how that communication can be more effective. At his level, he might not be comfortable with that because this is a senior person. In that case, he might need to get somebody else involved or wait till there is a team meeting or even just in an email, but somehow letting her know that he's concerned about the way they communicate. Then he could kind of take it the next step. It's like, when I see that reaction from you, my reaction is to do this. How can we make that better? Never placing the blame when we start using, you do that to me, that's an automatic way to get somebody defensive. Just say, when these situations happen, I feel like I need to communicate better. How can we work on that? So it is hard. It's a very hard thing. And when, especially in the manufacturing arena, when time is of the essence and deadlines and someone's waiting for something, emotions run high. And that's just who and how we are. But the first step with any leader in manufacturing is to address it and start to have some conversations on what are acceptable reactions, especially like when the line's moving, because safety becomes an issue, or then taking time at the end of the day or end of a shift or end of a month sometime to assess how that's going. Because we want to have reactions that if something bad is happening, it's hard to hold it all in, and you don't want it to fester and then blow up at some point. So looking at how people are reacting is important.
And I like that whole concept of just being open ourselves on what's triggering us, because I explained to him that leaders in manufacturing are just other people with a different role. They get triggered by emotions as well. So how can you reflect on yourself? And that's what I asked him. I said, how much do you own in this? And what's that difference? Because you write about that a little bit, in the fact of, if you just say it's all good and you don't acknowledge it, what does that do?
Well, that's somebody who either this situation has not made itself comfortable enough for them to be vulnerable and say, hey, I'm having a really rough day. It's not a good day. And, if the response is going to be like, well, suck it up. Sorry, they're not going to, put it out there. But if you'll allow me just to push through this just a bit, some of the problem that we can end up with when we feel we're either not allowed to express an emotion, or the emotion will be trivialized, or, it just someone isn't comfortable, it leads to a couple of things. Obviously, people quit. There's retention issues. There's people acting up because they might seriously want the attention and they're not getting it. So they might be acting out in some way. And then ultimately, the thing that can really, be detrimental to any individual or organization is mental health. And if someone is just going along saying it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, and yet then at the end of the day, they go home and take it out on their family, that's an issue that is affecting not only their own mental health, but the health of their family, the health of their friends. Or, if they're bottling it all up and just can't wait to, have the 6-pack at the end of the day, and that's beer, not soda. But, hey, we all self-medicate some way a little bit once in a while. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong. I'm not saying there's wrong with it. I drink. But relieving that stress in ways that become unhealthy, is hard. And I know in manufacturing, we've been a little bit behind in allowing space to have that mental health discussion. And so I would encourage listeners that if you are in that role where you feel like your mental health is not being honored, or there's not an outlet for it, or your organization just hasn't addressed it, I'm going to say it's time. It's time in this country that we know that if we're not there for our employees, or if our organization's not there for us, things can get real disruptive real fast.
Yeah. When I hear that term, when you know better, you do better. And this is where the passion of this podcast, and really saying to manufacturing, it is time. And people might think, I worked with Trevor before and he's told me to leave my emotions at the door. Well, that's because I didn't have the skill, and I didn't know that by just suppressing all that, you might just take that home and you can say, well, I can just bottle this up and I can just say it's all good and I don't have to deal with any of this, and I'll just keep going even though it bothers with me. But really it's not real, and it's going to impact your mental health at home, or you're not processing it and it's just building up. And so what does that mean when because I hear that terminology of we project that out to someone else. You talked about, if you suppress it.
Right. So we project our feelings onto others when we aren't dealing with them ourselves. So if, for example, I am frustrated with the way my shift went that day, I am then going to project that frustration out to, the next person I see, because that's, the emotion that I'm trying to deal with. The step that happens after this whole reacting phase. So once something has stretched us, an event, the person, there can be all kinds of things that trigger a response. Once we start to know what our responses are. So say your organization isn't right there for you, and they're not helping you process that. So taking this to your son's example, not helping you process it, don't know how to deal with it. Then that's when he needs to do the inward look and say, okay, is my response to, my manager the correct response? Is it getting me what I want? And the answer is probably not. Probably just coming back,
Mm-hmm.
giving her a dose, probably not. So then the next step I talk about in the book is the reframing. So we're reacting to something. And then once we gather this information about how we react, how others react, what triggers us to have those reactions, then we begin to reframe it. And in this case, the example of your son, say, okay, it's not working. I know how I react. I know how she reacts. How can I look at this differently? How can I come at this thing? And often the first stage in that is communicating. So we move
Mm-hmm.
from this reacting to reframing. And then within that reframing section of the resilience curve is we begin to communicate. And eventually this thing that is stretching us, reframe it. This could be this thing that makes us grow. This could be this thing that makes us a better person. This could give your son a skill set that he didn't have that allows him to be like, okay, I know how to talk to a manager now and ask for what I need, or a skill set to help him grow. So we want all these things that stretch us, all these things, that have disrupted us. The end game here is to let them reshape us. And that happens in this reframing phase. How am I going to grow? What am I going to do that's going to make me a better, stronger person from this disruptive event?
Yeah, I like the reframing and that, hey, you get to have some uncomfortable conversations with your leader. And hey, at 23 years old, you get to figure out the stuff that it took me 25 years to figure out. And if you can have those experiences now and reframe that into say, oh, interesting, I'm getting triggered. I'm probably triggering them. I want to maybe walk out the door today. And sometimes I get stuck too, right? I'm like, dude, just do your job. Just go to work and just do your job. But that's not always the best advice, because maybe it's just that pause of, hey, take 24 hours. How could you reframe this tomorrow morning?
Yeah, you touched on a phrase that I use in the book that I think is one of the most powerful things that we can do. And that's called pauses have power. See, if I just pause, like if this whole podcast went silent just for like 10 seconds, I would be like, wait, what happened? What happened? Because we're not used to those pauses that we need to process while we're reframing. We want to move forward, steamroll, get the answer, get what we need next. But I say, if you are going to pause and you need that time, you need 5 minutes to process. That's just a great tactic for when tempers are a little heated. Say, hey, I see where this is going. I need 10 minutes by myself to process. I've seen it happen in manufacturing specific. Some people forget to ask for the pause. They just walk out. They walk away. Like, I can't deal with this. I might blow up. I might have an issue. So I'm just going to walk away. Not the best. Communicate the pause. Say, I would like 10 minutes to process this. Then could we have a conversation? If the information is needed urgently, or your action is needed urgently, really assess, is this the right time for me to take the pause? If not, if you got to power through something, power through, get it done. At the end of the day, at the end of the shift, whatever it may be, say, okay, now we need to address it. We need to address what happened there. But yeah, reframing it's not an instantaneous thing that this thing's going to disrupt you. And then all of a sudden you're going to be like, I get to go about that in this new way. I mean, you could take a day, a week, a year. And it's the thing that happens during this phase, if this thing has kind of bugged us, stretched us, disrupted us, when we begin to reframe it, we might also hit some periods where we're fearful, like, it's always going to be this way. I'm never going to get through this in a different way. We're never going to get a solution. Negativity can come in, and in that resilience curve, we can get to this point where, like, yes, I got it. I'm reframing it. Things are good, but we can slip back down. And I use the pandemic as kind of a good example of this. Is, we're going to be fine. We're just going to close down for 2 weeks, right? And everybody's optimistic, and you got all this stuff, and then boom, we're right back down in this big gully of fear and doubt, and that's part of the process. And when I work with teams, when we start talking about fear, because no one likes to talk about what they're afraid of, but it drives so many of our actions. And when I relate it to the business setting, so maybe not so much the individual, like, what in this particular process, shift, team, where are your fears right now? Well, my fear is the customer is not going to get their product in time, and then it's all going to come back on us and we'll lose them. I mean, that's kind of a driving force. So really getting down and nitty gritty, that's my fear. Well, then start addressing it. Tell your salespeople, hey, have another conversation with this customer. Let them know this goal is a little unrealistic right now, given, supply chain and shipping. And the more we communicate through those fears, the easier they are to deal with.
We're always looking to connect to each other as human beings. And we're a long ways away from getting to that point where understanding that fine line of I'm just going to barf out all my problems and how I'm feeling versus, hey man, I'm trying to go fast, but there's some issues with the barcode scanning and this is kind of triggering this. And yeah, you're right. In manufacturing, you can't just walk out for a smoke, because you're stressed out, because and not tell anybody. One, it's a safety problem because where is this person now that you're missing and I'm responsible for you. And you really need to be able to figure out, say, hey, we got to keep working because it is manufacturing. But we got to freeze this conversation. I need to pause this conversation. And I think just trying to use that type of language and just saying, hey, I'm getting overly emotional and I'm going to make a mistake here. Could be safety, could be quality, could be productivity. But just the fact of if people, and I think it is more of an organization thing, because if you just start doing it yourself, which you're going to need to, because it's got to start somewhere. But if the whole organization get on board using the same language, saying, hey, when it gets temperature, what's the word, right? We need that pause. I like that, Kathy.
Yeah. And knowing, just the way that you work with manufacturing teams and giving them some of that skill set, taking the emotional inventory and the way that you work through the process, it does have to start organizationally. And so I would understand why someone who might be listening to this is like, I've got no control. I'm not in charge. I don't do that. But even just if someone could take away just some of that language that I'm frustrated by this, I don't want it to escalate. Could I have a meeting with you so we could work on some ways that when this happens, we all move through it with a more resilient attitude?
Yeah. And I'm grateful he does have a leadership team that he can do that. So he's going to try it. And he is accelerating his growth and he gets to have these experiences. He's blessed because he has, leaders that want to grow these positive behaviors. So first thing is reacting, just acknowledging it, right? That's kind of that first step. And then if we can pause, then we can kind of reframe it and say, okay, I get to kind of figure out what's going on here with this other person. Because we probably all woke up in the morning thinking we want to have a good day. Somehow we ended up here where I'm frustrated at you and you're frustrated at me and neither of us want to be here. So can we reframe that? So then how do we re-energize from there?
Well, that's the sweet spot. That's the sweet spot in the resilience curve, is that we want this thing. And real briefly, I'll explain the exercise that you've seen me do, Trevor, with the rubber band. So if the rubber band is stretched, you can shoot it, right? We all grew up shooting rubber bands at our siblings or something. So that stretch holds potential energy. That means that thing is ready to go. It can do something. But if you take that rubber band and you do not stretch it at all, it just drops. So realizing that these things that stretch us, these things that stress us out during the day, they are actually opportunities for growth. They're opportunities to energize us. When we shoot that rubber band, we're full of energy. We've learned something. We have a new skill set. Something in this major disruption has stretched us and it's taught us something, but it's also energized us to move forward. So some of that looks like organizational energy, leadership energy, personal energy. How has that thing energized you, your team, your organization? And then capturing that energy while you're still part of this disruptive thing. So it's like, oh my gosh, that horrible event happened and it cost us 2 hours in manufacturing time, but wait, what did we actually learn from it? And again, we might not be ready to assess it right away. We might still be having that emotion. We might still be reframing it. But once we're done with that kind of first couple phases of resilience, then we look at it and say, okay, what did we learn? How are we going to move forward when this happens again with new energy? Because we know how to solve the problem. When you think about the first time you have a problem and you solve it, well, then the next time it happens, you're like, wait, I know how to do this. I'm good. That's the energy you want from an organizational standpoint. I also say it's really important to find the drains, the energy drains that keep you from gaining that energy around an event. So if it's a perfect example of an organizational energy drain is communication. And it's probably the biggest. And all people want is better communication, more transparency. So if your organization isn't where you want it to be, start looking at those drains. And I'd say the first one is start with your communication. Is it happening? Start with, go from there as your training, which is also just another way of communicating. Is your training on point? Your training's not on point, your organization could be drained. But then after I look at the organizational energy and leadership energy, I, of course, love to talk about personal energy.
Yeah, I like the fact because when people get into manufacturing, they like the high energy. They like the high pace. That's why they get into it. And so they get confused of, we're going to talk about like how we're feeling and how everybody's responding. Like, are we all supposed to be like monotone? Well, no, because I like that analogy of you want that rubber band to be a little stretch because it is going to fly further and we want that, but we just don't want to be burnt out and take this. I like the analogy of the lack of communication creates that stretch so far that it's not going to shoot well because it's overstretched and it's not that kind of that resistance that we like that gives us that energy because we're challenged. And I just did a kickoff. Usually when I do a longer coaching session, I like to have like maybe the director of operations with that plant manager and we're having a conversation. And it was fantastic because they were talking about some of the difficult situations they had between each other where they really didn't agree on things. But the fact that they can have those disagreements and they know that each other's upset a little bit, it's a good tension and it actually got them energy. It's like, yes, this is what it looks like when it's good.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the stretch is good. You want that stretch because it is going to move you, your team, your organization through difficult times. But you're right. What happens if that rubber band stretches too far? It snaps. And that looks like burnout, fatigue, people walking out. I like to call it maxed out, burned out, stressed out, walking out. And that's what we don't want when we talk about personal energy. So managers, if you are listening to this, if you are seeing signs of that on your team, watch out because the easiest thing for them to solve that problem is to walk out. And that's what you don't want. And interestingly enough, back when I was doing a lot more work in the wellness space, so Trevor knows this, I have a background in wellness coaching, and then I moved more into business coaching, organizational energy and leadership. But because of my background in that, I used to do a lot of corporate wellness and was often in manufacturing facilities. And there was a lot of like pushback, like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to learn that. But as soon as like, we just kind of got real about it, I wasn't like telling people to eat kale salads. I was just like, this is how your body's energized each day. And stress is an energy zapper too. And if you are going around stressed out all the time, that has detrimental health, effects. So you don't want any of that too. So I encourage anyone listening who has a role within their organization, if wellness is not being addressed, start doing it. There was a survey out, it was in a different industry, but it was very much kind of frontline workers being interviewed. And they said one of their biggest concerns was their health and wellness. And a lot of this stuff doesn't cost a whole lot to do, for an organization. Just, have a walking challenge, have a, some sort of, once a month supply some information or do a lunch. There's a lot that can be done around that. But even people knowing that their organization cares about their health, that's kind of like a huge first step.
I think that's a great note to leave it on. Like just the fact of you don't need to go out and do a whole bunch of programs. Just let them know that you care, right? And let them know that I too am getting frustrated. Maybe I need to. This is how I'm reacting. I'm going to reframe. And then what are the things we're going to do to re-energize? Kathy, thank you so much. Awesome to have you on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I hope you have a big powered up day.
Hey folks, appreciate you taking the time to join us today. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone. Haven't subscribed yet? Do it now. Remember, if you want results, the key is increasing your awareness of how you show up.